Alrighty. Hey everybody. I'd like to thank you all for coming today, or if you're watching over the live stream, thanks for watching. My name is Katchmar. I'm a senior in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm pursuing a Master's of Public Health at the BU School of Public Health. Today, I'd want to talk to you about my Keystone project, where I analyzed how state departments of health portrayed the risks associated with e-cigarette use on their websites in the context of the EVALI outbreak. This work is part of a manuscript that I've submitted for publication. And as an overview, I'll be telling you about how the EVALI outbreak, where a number of people were sickened with a pneumonia-like illness, was originally presumed to be caused by e-cigarette use. And this led a lot of folks to believe that e-cigarette use was as bad as, or perhaps worse than, cigarette smoking. By January of 2020, though, we knew that vaporizable THC use and not e-cigarette use was actually the cause of this illness. However, over the course of my project, I found that a number of state departments of health didn't actually update their guidance on their websites to note this. And this was interesting, given our current context and conversation surrounding public health messaging. The main takeaway that I got from this project, and the one that I want to share with the people in my field, is that departments of health and public health authorities have a responsibility to the people that they serve to accurately share the risk associated with things such as e-cigarette use. And in order to do that, they must update their guidance on their websites to note this. So e-cigarettes, as you probably know, are devices that heat and vaporize liquids that contain nicotine and usually flavoring. And this vapor is then inhaled, much like a regular cigarette. There's been a lot of concern surrounding e-cigarette use, particularly among young people, because it was thought that e-cigarette use would facilitate a transition to cigarette smoking. However, this isn't the case, and instead we've seen e-cigarettes act as an effective means of smoking cessation. A number of devices now have been marketed as smoking cessation tools. In the summer of 2019, there was an outbreak of what the CDC had originally called e-cigarette or vaping use associated lung injury, or EVALI. Where a number of people were sickened with this pneumonia-like illness. And it got its name because a lot of the people who were sickened said that they had used e-cigarettes prior to getting sick. 2,800 people got sick, and 68 of them later died. However, by January of 2020, it was found that vitamin E acetate, a thickening agent in some vaporizable THC products, actually caused this illness, not e-cigarettes. However, a number of state and local governments used the EVALI outbreak as a reason to restrict e-cigarette use and purchasing. There were a number of emergency bans on the sale of e-cigarettes, including a 4-month ban here in Massachusetts. There were excise taxes levied on the products to make them more expensive and thus harder to get, and there were bans on flavored products. However, there's a concern with this approach because we know that e-cigarettes and combustible cigarettes are economic substitutes, meaning that an increase in the price of one will lead to an increase in demand for the other. Think of things like Coke and Pepsi. We know that people have a preference, but it's thought that with enough incentive, you could get people to switch from one to the other. And this appears to be the case when we look at the effects of excise taxes on e-cigarettes. For example, one study that was looking at the effect of a hypothetical tax on e-cigarettes found that 5.5 packs of combustible cigarettes would be purchased for every e-cigarette pod not purchased if e-cigarettes were taxed at the same rate as combustible cigarettes. Another study indicated that there was a 13% increase in combustible cigarette purchasing for every 10% rise in e-cigarette prices due to an excise tax in Minnesota. It's not a stretch then to infer that other means to make it less desirable or harder to purchase e-cigarettes, such as bans and negative messaging, will also lead to an increase in combustible cigarette purchasing. And this is concerning because we know that e-cigarettes and combustible cigarettes are economic substitutes, meaning that an increase in the price of one will lead to an increase in we know that e-cigarettes and combustible cigarettes are economic substitutes, and we know that combustible cigarettes are more expensive than e-cigarettes and more harmful. So I knew that state and local governments didn't appreciate e-cigarette purchasing due to their taxes and their bans, but I wanted to know how state departments of health portrayed the risks associated with e-cigarette use on their websites, specifically in relation to the EVALI outbreak. What did they say the cause of EVALI was? And did they update their messaging when we knew that vaporizable THC use was the cause of EVALI? I also wanted to know if this messaging was linked in any way to changes in e-cigarette and cigarette use purchasing over time. To answer these questions, I conducted a 2-part study with the help of my advisors. For the first part, I analyzed State Department of Health messaging at 3 time points: August 2019, which was the peak of the EVALI outbreak; January 2020, when it was found that vaporizable THC use caused EVALI; and the present day, which at the time that I was working on this study was the late summer and early fall of 2021. I'd used archive.org for the earlier 2 time points. It's a helpful website because it takes a snapshot of what a web page looks like at a certain date. I was able to scroll through all these old versions of these websites to see what each listed the cause of EVALI to be. I wanted to see if this messaging was linked in any changes to e-cigarette and combustible cigarette use prevalence, so I used data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, which is a yearly questionnaire that asks Americans about their health and any risky behaviors they partake in, including e-cigarette and combustible cigarette use. This is a bit of what I found. This map shows the status of state website content in January of 2020, after it was found that vaporizable THC use and not e-cigarette use caused EVALI. The states in gray didn't have data available for this time point. This was just because the web page either wasn't archived or maybe it didn't exist in the first place. The states in green had indicated that vaporizable THC use caused EVALI, so they had updated their information. While the states in blue did not update their messaging, they still said that e-cigarette use caused EVALI. These charts show the prevalence of e-cigarette and combustible cigarette use at that same time point. The darker the state, the higher the prevalence. I'd expected states that did not update their messaging, ones that still said that e-cigarette use caused EVALI, to have lower e-cigarette use and higher combustible cigarette use. However, this didn't appear to be the case. You can see there's a mix of prevalence among these states. Similarly, I'd expected states that did update their messaging, those that said that e-cigarette use did not cause EVALI, would have higher e-cigarette use and lower combustible cigarette use, but this didn't appear to be the case either. As you can see, it didn't really look like messaging was related in any way to e-cigarette or cigarette use at that time. These charts show the prevalence of e-cigarette and cigarette use over time. The line in blue indicates data for states that did not update their messaging. The line in green indicates data for states that did. And here they are together. As you can see, the trends are fairly similar over time, and between 2019 and 2020, the last 2 points on those graphs, the trends were essentially parallel. There didn't appear to be a difference in the changes in e-cigarette and combustible cigarette use over time, depending on whether or not a state updated its messaging. And so you might be thinking, well, then what's the point, right? Like, does messaging not have any effect on e-cigarette and combustible cigarette use? I'm here to tell you that messaging still does matter. States and the federal government portrayed e-cigarette use in a fairly negative light, and they continue to do so. This is a PSA from the Food and Drug Administration. While we didn't see people switching from e-cigarette use to combustible cigarette use due to this messaging, people still thought that e-cigarette use was as bad as or worse than cigarette smoking. In October of 2019, only 30% of Americans thought that e-cigarette use carried less risk than combustible cigarette use. And so while we didn't see people switching, there might have been people who were hoping to quit smoking cigarettes. They might have wanted to switch to e-cigarettes, but after seeing this messaging, they thought, well, there is no difference, right? And they would have continued to smoke. In public health, there's a concept called harm reduction, where we acknowledge that people are going to engage in some risky behaviors. We can't prevent all of it, but we could certainly make it easier for people to take on less risk. However, if this messaging led people to wrongly believe that e-cigarette use was as bad as or worse than cigarette smoking, they may have continued to smoke, thereby increasing the amount of risk that they're carrying on a daily basis. And so the main point that I got from this project, and the one that I hope to share with people in my field, is that departments of health and public health authorities have a responsibility to the people that they serve to accurately share the risk associated with things such as e-cigarette use. In order to do that, though, they must update their messaging on a timely manner. So I'd like to thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. All right, questions, comments? Susan.
If you go back to the slide where you showed the graphs on the same graph,
Yes.
I was noticing, so do you think there's an explanation or some reason, or is this just kind of correlated, that the states that updated their websites just generally throughout this whole time, even before and after, had more e-cigarette use and less cigarette use than the other states?
Yeah, so I'm going to put a big asterisk next to these graphs because we only had, I think, 10 states that actually had full data for all of the surveys, all of the website data. So I think if I had that information, I think it would probably look different. You know, I originally thought maybe states that are more progressive that are updating their messaging on a timely manner, you know, maybe there are other differences in how they run their public health departments. But when I was looking at the maps of states that updated their messaging even right after EVALI, I didn't see much of a correlation. You know, like Texas updated their messaging, but Florida didn't. Like, I wouldn't have thought that that would be the sense. So, honestly, I don't really know, why they look like that. But yeah. Really?
Great presentation.
Thanks.
I'm wondering, I know the scope of your project was on the departments of public health and state messaging, but
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you know at all how powerful private messaging is, especially by e-cigarette companies and cigarette companies or any other stakeholders.
It's definitely powerful, and I wish that I could have looked at that, but I partially decided on Department of Health messaging because it's something that I can look back and look at various variations of websites. It was very easy data. I do think the messaging, you know, when you see the Truth Initiative, although that is pseudo-governmental, right? But I think public health, departments of health websites contributed there were other actors in this. So there are other people that would have contributed as much to this sort of thing. And I think it is important. And if I were to continue this project, which I think I would like to, I would want to look at how other external actors portrayed things like e-cigarette use. It's just a bit harder to look back and see what they had said over time. But yes.
So just sort of a general question about this phenomenon of updating websites. So if I go to the website in January and they tell me something, what's going to motivate me to go in July and discover that there's new advice?
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't, right? But I also use the messaging or the websites as a proxy for how else they're portraying this thing, right? Again, I couldn't really see what, say, a poster looked like at a bus stop, but I could know if they're saying e-cigarette use causes this illness, and if it's on their website, it is probably in other messaging that they're sharing. So yes, is that kind of?
No, I was just thinking this was a more general question for public health messaging and so forth. And then just one other thing, if you were to study another phenomenon, what might that be? There's so many things where the messaging must be challenging and the medical advice changes and so forth.
I mean, COVID's obviously the big one, just because we know that like nuance is important, but it's very hard to get nuance across. Even with this, like there's nuance. I wouldn't tell people to start smoking e-cigarettes, but I would tell people who currently smoke cigarettes to switch to e-cigarettes, right? But it's very hard to like put that on a poster, you know, especially when you're talking to people like high schoolers, you know, it's very hard to get that sort of nuance across. And I think we could say the same for COVID at this point in time. So, yeah.
Any more questions? If not, let's, oops.
So, Amanda, I just wanted to ask you to comment a little bit about the fact that we didn't, you know, this wasn't planned, but it was just quite a coincidence that COVID occurred right after this e-cigarette outbreak. And what are your thoughts about kind of what the lessons that we learned from the response to COVID versus the e-cigarette outbreak? And also, you know, do you think that the credibility of organizations like the CDC, which just calling this EVALI was like, as you explained, a huge mistake,
Right.
Because it wasn't e-cigarette related. You know, is it possible that that had any effect on COVID? In other words, if the CDC is losing credibility, could that have affected their credibility with their COVID messages? And we know that their credibility is really, unfortunately, at quite an all-time low right now. So I guess the question is, you know, what do your findings about the importance of giving truthful health messages? What are the consequences for that, for something as large as COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think calling this EVALI, like it did associate, like it put a cause right with it, right? But like I guess at the time what they knew, it wasn't a terrible guess, right? I think it's unfortunate to see how messaging hasn't done what it needs to do all the time. And I would hope that lessons could be learned from this, lessons could be learned from COVID. I don't know. I mean, it's tough. I wish we could accurately, like, I think it's hard for people to admit when they make a mistake too. It's hard for people to go back and say, well, we were wrong about this. I think part of it with e-cigarettes and stuff is that people were already concerned about e-cigarette use. And so when EVALI popped up, it was very easy for them to say, oh, well, let's just ban e-cigarettes. Like, let's make it hard for people to get those things. We already don't want kids using them. We don't want people using them. So, like, let's just ban it all. And this was a very timely thing for them to use EVALI as a reason to just place all these restrictions. And then when it was found that vaporizable THC use caused it, there wasn't a lot of effort to go back and, like, correct it and let people know that, like, it's not actually e-cigarettes doing this. Like, you guys could use e-cigarettes. And so I think being able to admit when there's failures in messaging or just mistakes, like I don't even want to call it like a purposeful failure, right? Like I think it might have been a mistake, you know, but it's very hard for people to admit mistakes because I don't think we as a public are very forgiving of mistakes either. So I don't know if that answers your question. But
yeah, definitely. And just one follow-up question is, you mentioned that, you know, clearly one of the potential downfalls or adverse consequences of these false messages is that it might increase cigarette use. But I wonder if you could just talk a second about cannabis use itself.
Yeah.
We're facing a situation now where, because of the legalization of recreational cannabis, we are starting to see really, really high rates of youth cannabis use.
Mhm.
And here was an opportunity to really warn youth, honestly, about, you're getting
Yeah.
drugs off the street. Look what might happen.
Mhm.
Yet that was totally squandered.
Right. Yeah, and again, I think especially things like cannabis, right? It's already like no one wants to say, yeah, here's how you could use cannabis safely, especially because federally, like, it's not allowed. The CDC is never going to come out and say, like, smoke the actual plant as opposed to use these. Like, for everything, it's like just don't use it at all. And again, we know that people are using it. Why not, acknowledge that and tell people how to do it safely? Again, I think it is just this reluctance to be nuanced in their messaging, to let people do things safely. So, all right. Good. Thanks.